All right, hello everyone. We are here with the one, the only Philip Goff. There are no others. Philip has come to Oxford to participate in an Oxford Union debate, which Amos and I watched. It was, very, very exciting debate that involved Peter Atkins calling religion an evil weevil like 9 times in increasingly strange way. So we thought, given that Philip's in the area, we'd have him on. Philip, thank you for appearing.
Thank you. Lovely to meet and chat to you guys. One of my favorite philosophy podcasts.
I think you call it your favorite techie philosophy podcast. Is that
yes,
right? Yeah.
Yes.
Many people are saying this.
I like your irony. I mean, you're shit at philosophy, unfortunately, but you got the good irony, so that works well.
Yeah, people who think who make errors as grievous as thinking that the multiverse commits the inverse Gambour's fallacy. They just can't be trusted on these issues.
Here we go. There you go. That's it. That's both irony and shit philosophy. Well
yeah. We thought we'd talk about so you believe in this sort of wishy-washy, lowercase g, maybe uppercase g, depending on but
whether you write it as a lowercase or an uppercase.
Right. Yeah, I guess that is what it would depend on. But so you believe in this god of limited power, and Amos and I, of course, we have the correct view.
He's nice though.
Okay, well, yeah, that's a good thing.
We agree with that.
Yeah. Come.
So I guess so we can talk about some of the motivations for an unlimited God, but first, do you want to lay out sort of like what's the motivation for thinking that God is limited?
I guess quite simply that there's things traditional theism struggles to explain, like suffering. Why would a nice, all-powerful God allow that? There's things, but there's also things atheism struggles to explain: fine-tuning of physics for life, psychophysical harmony, and God of limited powers.
I thought evolution explained that.
Say again?
I thought evolution explained that.
Don't get me started. Yeah, it's hard to persuade anyone of the psychophysical harmony issue, even though it's going to change the world, but you can't get anyone to see what the hell it's all about.
There's a psychophysical harmony factory opening just down the road.
Yeah. So it's too hard, isn't it? It's too hard for the hoi polloi.
Yeah. So I guess regarding psychophysical harmony, one of my worries with the limited God is I think it just pushes the problem of psychophysical harmony back a level, where if we ask, why is there psychophysical harmony in the mind of the limited God? Why is it that its mind corresponds with changes in the material world? It seems like you just have to posit that that's brute. Well, if you have an unlimited God, then you can derive it from some deeper property, like God's perfection, or God being this just essentially limitless mind.
Yeah, I mean, I don't deny there's a greater simplicity to the traditional God view. Maybe for those reasons you can ground it in perfection or something. But ultimately, we want our theory to fit the data. We don't. If we've got a slightly less simple view that fits the data, but we don't sort of tie ourselves in knots trying to keep the view simple. It's the first thing is account for the data and keep it as simple as possible. So yeah, I think it's worth having a little bit more complexity to deal with suffering, get a better explanation of suffering.
But I mean, you can always add in some stipulations that make your theory more complicated and that make it fit the data. So for example, suppose that I get 10 royal flushes in poker. And we have this hypothesis, which is that, a fairy using magic made me get 10 royal flushes in poker. And I say, well, maybe it's not that simple, but it fits the data really well if we build in the supposition that the fairy would do this particular thing. In that case, just because it's so defective, because it's adding new things to our ontology, we would say, even though it fits the data pretty well, it's not a good theory. And in particular, it's not a good theory if you need to add some extra stipulation. Like if the thing doesn't by default explain the data, but if you just need to add some extra thing to fit the data, then it doesn't have a very satisfying explanation of the data. And so if that's true in the psychophysical harmony case, if the reason why the limited God only explains psychophysical harmony, if you build in this extra property where it's psychophysically harmonious, then it seems like it doesn't explain the data that well.
Well, I think in the original case you gave, we have quite a good understanding of what's going on there, because it ends up having, God, I'm a bit hungover today to think about the details of Bayesian reasoning, but it ends up having a very low prior probability because you could have a hypothesis where there's a fairy that likes a different combination of cards, a different combination of cards, and you've got to divide your prior probability but equally. And so it ends up, I think you do get
Right.
evidential support, but it ends up having a very low prior probability.
Right.
I don't think that that applies in this case. I mean, I think my case is more like, take an example from Richard Swinburne that I think works against him. He tells me, I'm taking it on his authority, that before we had evidence that the speed of light was a particular speed, we took it to be infinite because that's simpler. Right now, then we get evidence that no, it's this finite speed. We don't sort of, oh no, try and keep it simple, try and keep it infinite, you know. But no, we just say, okay, that will account for the data better. So I suppose I'd want to say to you, why isn't my limited God like that? You know, you start off, the omni God is simpler, but then you got suffering. You add a little bit of complexity to account for that data, just like you add a little bit of complexity to your hypothesis of the speed of light to account for the data.
Right. Well, I think even a bit of extra complexity, if it's in terms of the fundamental and unexplained stuff, is actually really, really costly. Right. So imagine we're considering two hypotheses. And one of the hypotheses is that God knows every fact. And the other hypothesis is that God knows every fact except the population of Cambridge or something, of that blasted university.
Yeah, but that's
right. That's a bad theory because even if that explained the data, like even if there was some fact that was likely on that supposition, namely why he allows Cambridge to remain in existence, if he doesn't know about it, then it makes more sense.
But that's I mean, there's something different about that, isn't it? That's sort of very arbitrary and inelegant.
I think there's something similarly arbitrary and inelegant about God with limited powers, who has just a specific limited range of powers and properties.
He's maxed out in every other direction.
But there's sort of, it's not just kind of honing in on one particular place and time and saying it's, you know, God's got these. Look, I would say my hypothesis is simpler than physics. Right, it's simpler than physics because what are the limitations? At least if we're just thinking about fine tuning, let's just think about fine tuning. What are God's limitations? Take physics, take the numbers out, you get a mathematical structure there. God has to create a universe with that structure, right? So, I mean, if it's simpler than physics, no one's saying to the physicists, you know, why aren't you having a, you know, it's too complicated. It's, you know,
I said that's them a lot every day.
Well, we want it to be as simple as possible, right? But we don't, you know, we go for the simplest theory that accounts for the data.
I don't know that your theory is simpler than physics because you have to add in both the description of the powers that the entity has to bring about the different models of physics. And also you have to build in that there's this mind at the fundamental level. And I feel like this will have to be a pretty complicated mind if it has this specific range of powers and desires that are going to have to be built in at the fundamental level. If you're a perfect being theist, you can just say there's this mind wholly without limits. And
hold on. But the traditional theist has to add a mind at the bottom as well.
Right. So the traditional theist has to add a mind, but they can just say, look, this mind has one. There's one core fact about this mind. It's essentially unlimited. So nothing constrains its power, nothing constrains its knowledge. And then, you know, because it understands what's good, it's motivated to follow.
Simpler, right? But it's not a better thing for you that you have to add a mind. That I have to add a mind because you have to add a mind as well.
No.
It's just how complex is my mind.
I was talking about,
and I'm saying it's the mind itself is simpler than physics. Specifying the limitations of the mind is simpler than physics, right? And then you explain physics in terms of the mind, right? I mean, that's what Richard Swinburne said, right? He explains physics in terms of God. I explain physics. You know, physics came from God, the creator. But God has certain limitations, but those limitations are simpler than physics.
Yeah, I guess. I wasn't comparing an unlimited God to a limited God in terms of the point about minds. I think the fact there's a mind in both cases, that doesn't differentiate it in terms of simplicity. I think that what differentiates it in terms of simplicity is that now the limited God has to build in all these sort of arbitrary stipulations, while the unlimited God won't. What I think, I was just comparing it to physics, where if you have to build in a mind at the fundamental level and all these powers to bring about different physical structures, then, I mean, first of all, you have this just fundamental, ineliminable dualism, where it's a hard word to say, where like
very well.
Yeah, thank you. That really means a lot.
Thank you. It's okay. Anytime. shit philosophy, but you can say it in the middle very well. Of course, being Irish, you've very good philosophy as well.
Yeah, I appreciate it.
Anyway.
Yours is pretty good too. Except when you talk about this whole inverse Danforth fallacy stuff, then you sort of.
Look, I mean, you've got to see there's a difference, right, between physicists aim for these very simple laws. People look at general relativity, think, oh, there's just a beautiful simplicity and elegance. That's very different to like a special privilege for Cambridge in particular or something. There's something arbitrary and inelegant about that. I would say my limited God, because it mirrors physics, is elegant and fairly elegant and simple kind of fundamental facts like physics. I mean, they correspond to physics.
I agree there's something like especially inelegant about if it's just one fact that it doesn't know. Yeah. But I mean, okay, so rather than have it not know one fact, let's make it so that it knows every fact except 10,000, and that it can do everything except 10,000 things, and that it's good in all cases except 10,000. So we could just specify 10,000 specific actions, right? But the more things you take away, you just get the limited God.
Can I change the hypothetical a little bit? So imagine that the God is all powerful, but the limits on its knowledge are exactly corresponding to its ability to change the laws of physics, right? So it only knows enough to create the laws of physics as they are, but it doesn't know any more than that. Would you see that as equally simple as the view that God has powers that are limited in just that way?
Like the actual physics with all the constants as they are.
Yeah. It knows enough to make the constants exactly as they are. It has the power to make them differently, but it doesn't know.
That would be a little bit less simple, wouldn't it? And it wouldn't explain the fine tuning, so it wouldn't have any evidential support.
Oh, it would, right? So it wants to make a universe as fine-tuned as possible, but its knowledge just caps off at exactly where the fine-tuning actually is in our worlds.
So it can't create a world with different values of the constants?
It could create a value with less fine-tuned constants, but it can't sort of fine-tune it so well that it eliminates evil. So the knowledge just caps off at exactly that level. Seems like that's a very bad theory.
Struggling to get. So it could create a non-fine-tuned universe.
Yeah.
Is it in knowledge rather than power?
Yeah. So I'm changing it so the limit is in knowledge, not power. Seems like that should be simpler than physics, or as simple as physics.
What would be the motivation for this?
The same as yours. I'm wondering if they're just equally good theories.
I mean, that's less simple than my theory, right?
Why?
Because my God can choose any numbers, right? That would, so I mean, look, physicists try to get rid of the values of the constants. Ideally, you'd like to get rid of the values of the constants because, there's something arbitrary about it. It's exactly this number. Ideally, you want to get rid of it. And you do on my theory, right? Because we've got an explanation of
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
That's okay. Don't worry. Don't worry. In a YouTube thing.
That's cute.
We are at Weatherspoons, by the way. I thought Amos wanted to go to the Bodleian Library, but I thought Weatherspoons is more authentically Oxford.
Okay. So your view is that God can create a universe, but he can't create it that well. So he can create it very well, just well enough to fine tune, but not well enough to get rid of the evil that would eventually result, right?
Well, that way of framing it makes it sound a bit inelegant, but I think there's a more elegant way of putting it, which is that you take the structure of physics with the numbers out and you say he's limited to that structure, where he can do whatever numbers he wants. So then it's simpler than physics because it's physics, but you've got a deeper explanation of why the constants have the values they do.
Yeah, so I'm thinking on this rival theory, his knowledge is what prevents him from creating it with a different structure. So his knowledge limits him to creating that structure, and then he can choose any numbers he wants, let's say.
The knowledge. But then that's less simple, isn't it? Because you're limiting. We're being very patriarchal here, aren't we? Using the male pronoun for God.
Well, I am.
I can't decide whether to use she or they in my paper.
Well, I mean, are you a Trinitarian now? Because it seems like they is the
Yeah,
appropriate
I
pronoun.
think that's the. I guess God's non-binary, and if it's Trinity as well, then that pissed people off on Twitter when I said God's non-binary. Anyway, let's get back to the substance.
Yeah, God obviously, is biologically male, has male genitalia.
It was a good response from a conservative Christian philosopher saying, "You're denying God his preferred pronouns in the Bible." So that was kind of funny. Anyway, what were we talking
Yeah.
about?
So I guess
Yeah,
so-
I have to think more about the example. It's an interesting example, but yeah, it seems to me a little bit
yeah.
unnecessarily
So
complex.
I think there's extra complexity in terms of fine tuning, but then also so regarding psychophysical harmony,
Yes.
you might initially have suspected that our psychophysical laws were simple and were probable. But then once you realize psychophysical harmony happens, then you come to see, actually, this was a really surprising way for the psychophysical laws to turn out.
Yeah.
So I think you get a similar point with a limited God, where imagine it had never occurred to you that psychophysical harmony is a thing, but you believe in a limited God. And then you realize psychophysical harmony. Well, now you realize, look, of all the fundamental agents there could be, most of them would just have radical disharmony between their mental states and their physical states. Most of them would just have some random chaotic internal mental life. Many of them would probably have, if they don't have a random chaotic internal mental life, would just not have any nice connection between the mental and the physical. And so you would just not get anything, not get anything probable. So I think once we understand the phenomenon of psychophysical harmony, which very few people do, there are like 10 of us, but then I think that will go to show why the limited God has an even lower prior than you would have suspected, just based on how complex you would think it was initially.
Well, maybe I should clarify my view on psychophysical harmony here. So I don't actually think you can explain psychophysical harmony with a God of limited powers, as Joe Schmidt, got his name then, said in his response to Cameron Bertuzzi, saying he no longer has any respect for atheism, and saying, because you could, even if the problem of evil sort of is compelling, you can turn to my limited God. But yeah, I don't think that would work well for psychophysical harmony, because why couldn't God just make everyone feel bliss or something? It's hard to see how you could limit it. So actually, the way I do it is I explain psychophysical harmony in terms of libertarian free will, and then I think on Bayesian grounds, libertarian free will is more to be expected on theism than atheism. So there's a sort of two-step there. A recent paper, I put up a recent paper for a volume on God, but the publisher told me to take it down. So it's the first time I've written a paper. I did sign a contract that I didn't read that said that, but 2 years after it's published, I'll be able to put it up. But new paper on, should we go for God or the multiverse if we think both are options on fine tuning? Anyway, I went into all this, but I can't put it on.
Sorry, which one should we go for in your view?
Well, because we'll come back to them, but just but then coming back to it, so what? How does my God explain psychophysical harmony? Well, it's just God responds rationally to mental states, is omniscient, responds rationally to, it's a fundamental principle of rationality. I think that pretty much explains it. So it's not just I wouldn't sort of say it's just arbitrarily carving up the psychophysical laws. It's fundamental. It's a deeper explanation than that, which makes it more elegant. That just fight it over the microphone.
Wait, so sorry.
God can just respond rationally
Is it that there's the?
I'm not sure. I think God's quite omniscient, actually. I'm starting to think God doesn't have memories.
Okay.
So doesn't know the past. Anyway. Anyway, that's another issue.
Yeah. So is it that the general principle by which things respond rationally to the contents of their experiences explains why God does? Or is it that God explains why there's this broader principle where things respond rationally to the contents of their experience?
I don't think we need God to explain psychophysical harmony. I think we postulate that matter is just inherently rational and disposed to respond rationally. Or if you don't like my weird panagentialist view, you could just have libertarian free will emerging at a higher level. But I take free will to be to involve a primitive disposition to respond rationally, and then natural selection exploits that, because natural selection, if it can exploit that, it doesn't have to sort of program rationality. It just gives you the right beliefs, desires, gives you free will. You're going to respond rationally. And then, yeah, in terms of God, God also has that kind of primitive rationality that explains her psychophysical harmony. Yeah, so in both cases, but I don't think we need God to explain our psychophysical harmony.
Yeah, so this leads me to something which I think will probably segue into our discussion on the problem of evil. So you sent us your paper outlining your version of Christianity.
Yeah, you guys are
earlier.
the first people to see it. You're so privileged.
We are. We really are.
Wow.
Except the peer reviewers, who one of whom said reject. But
that was me.
They thought it was too fringe. Christians don't believe this stuff, so why are we publishing it?
Yeah, I mean, fair enough, honestly. But yes. So your view of Jesus' resurrection appearances is that Jesus didn't appear corporeally; he appeared as a vision, right? So like that's roughly the idea. And so it seems like for God to do that, he's going to have to be able to affect people's conscious states, right? So like he's going to have to affect what's going on in the heads of the disciples, those who saw Jesus. And then I think, once you have that, it's going to be harder for the limited God to get off the hook for the problem of evil. So seems like basically all the evils that there are parasitic in some way on consciousness. So just think of like all the things that you think are intrinsically bad: pain, false beliefs, illusions, like
claiming that the multiverse commits the inverse Gambor's fallacy.
right. So these things all require consciousness, and so if God can like tinker with the
the most heinous of evils
with the one its likeness of consciousness in the case of Jesus' disciples, then it seems like he should just be able to do that with respect to like all of the intrinsically bad states, and so he's not off the hook with the problem of evil. And if your view is he can just tinker with the psychophysical states of some of the disciples, that seems like it's going to be a very janky limited God hypothesis, where there's a very arbitrary cutoff between what God can do with regard to consciousness and what he can't.
Yeah. I feel a bit self-conscious talking about the resurrection in Wetherspoons with people in the earshot. But anyway,
did you know Jesus loves you?
Oh, that's lovely. I always thought that might be true, but I wasn't sure. Yeah, well, firstly, this does get much harder if you're trying to bring in Christianity, right? So I think if you're just dealing with fine-tuning, then my view is obviously the best theory. Very simple, accounts for all suffering and fine-tuning. It's not, it's very simple to specify the limitations, right? But yeah, bringing in Christianity is a little trickier. But I did go into this in quite some detail in the paper. So the thought was, Jesus, several lines here. So I think I think basically religious practice or spirituality has to have the idea that in some sense God can allow us to experience them. And so what I say in the paper is, but we've also got to not go back to hidden, the problem of hiddenness. Why? Mm-hmm. So I say, God can sort of convey to us this generic sense of God's presence, right? But it's you've got to be in the right frame of mind, maybe meditation or experience of beauty or something. And it's a kind of generic sense of God's presence, right? Then the other aspect of this theory is that the participatory theory of salvation, that some sense through the resurrection of Jesus, which I've got a funny view of, God and the universe came closer together, right? God shared in our form of existence so that we share in God's form of existence. And there was a radical transformation in our awareness and knowledge of God. Our experience of God was deepened, right? At that moment. So it's a sort of historical claim that at that precise moment, first Easter Sunday, or maybe a bit earlier and they didn't notice, our intimacy with our experience of God was transformed for everybody, right? But then, it's very complicated, then the thought would be, okay, so what was special about the first Christians? Well, the thought was that Jesus will have kind of prepped them whilst still alive in the
Right.
normal way, prepped his followers to understand and be open to experiencing this radical transformation in our experience of God. And it says in the Gospels, he talked about his resurrection. They didn't understand it, but
Yeah.
so that's the thought. So these, the Peter, Mary Magdalene, were really prepped to be open to this radical transformation in our experience of God and to understand what was going on.
And so when they had the radical transformation, did it look like they were seeing a body? Or
no,
something?
I think it was like how you imagine Paul on the road to Damascus. So I think, Easter Sunday morning,
Okay.
Mary Magdalene first, and then she's edited out in Paul's letter. He's just suddenly thrown to the ground and just having these, and then Peter does it, and then 11 people at once do it. And so yeah, it's just, and it says in all the gospel accounts, it's quite striking, that there's doubt. It says, some people that saw and doubted. And so I've already, some people were like, I'm not getting it. Oh my God. It's maybe like one of those, magic eye pictures that, where you sort of, you have to sort of look at, and then you see it and it's definitely there. So it's like something that was an altered state of consciousness, but it was so radically new, and it's happening to groups and individuals that it was clear, it was obvious something radically new was happening.
Do you think the tomb was empty?
Yes. So my view, and this is, I've been very influenced by Dale Allison here, is that the early Christians believed that the resurrection and the ascension were the same event. So it wasn't, as we see in Luke's gospel, and the Acts of the Apostles that the same author wrote, that Jesus comes out of the grave, walks around for a while, and then floats up to heaven. Rather, the resurrection on Easter Sunday or before was the moment Jesus was sort of physically absorbed back into God. And this fits with the participatory view, because this is the moment the fullness of God takes on a physical nature, becomes more like us, and then we become able to share more deeply in the divine life.
So because time is ticking, I guess we should sort of transition over to the problem of evil.
So you're completely convinced on that? Good.
Yeah, sure. Could you first sort of lay out what you take to be the strongest
I
argument?
just want to
for
add before we
Yeah.
move on to that.
Yeah.
I'm very uncertain whether this is true, because
Sure.
it is bold claims. It is bold claims. I think there's reason to take it seriously, but it is bold claims, and that lowers the prior probability somewhat. So I've sort of said I'm kind of around 50%, and I think faith is more of trust rather than.
Yeah.
But I basically think Christianity could be true, could be not true. I wouldn't be surprised either way. I just want to fit that in.
We agree that Christianity could be true and could be not true.
in the sense that I'm not confident either way.
Yeah.
Anyway, go on, carry on.
I mean, so sometimes you frame the problem of evil in deontological terms, and I want to kind of convince you that actually, like, you shouldn't.
Yeah.
And really, really, like, the only problem of evil worth worrying about is the axiological problem of evil.
Right. Good.
That's because I think there's a good solution to the deontological problem of evil.
Yeah,
Matthew
I
thinks
have
it's
I have my own
deontology.
solution, which is that deontology is false.
Oh, right, you're consequential.
Yeah.
Oh, right, cool.
I mean, his newsletter is Bentham's Bulldog.
Yeah.
So
Oh, wow.
but I'm a deontologist, and so my approach
too.
is
I'm a sort of
yeah.
on consequentialist side in many practical matters, but
Yeah.
but I'm not a pure consequentialist.
Sure. I mean, so my thought is this: suppose that we've solved the axiological problem of evil. So there are a bunch of great goods that God can
Yeah.
get from allowing evil. Okay,
Yeah.
I don't know how to solve that, but suppose we have solved it. Then I think, okay, if God could permissibly get those goods, then he would. Right? We get some prediction that God would, if there were a permissible way for him to get to them. And then I claim there is a permissible way for God to get those goods, namely by asking our consent beforehand. Okay, so on my favorite deontological theodicy, what happens is we pre-exist at our births. God could make that happen. He's omnipotent. And then we consented to God allowing us to suffer through all of the various evils that we suffer. We didn't consent to the evils themselves, right? So people do have, if you punch me, I didn't consent to you punching me, but I did consent to God not intervening. And so I think that gets God deontologically off the hook for the various evils we suffer. And so I think that this doesn't add a bunch of extra cost, where if you've already solve the axiological problem of evil and you think there's a permissible way for God to do it, and it's this, then you just get that for free.
Yeah, I like it. Well, it's funny you should say this actually, because I'm just starting tomorrow on Monday, researching, writing this new book on reimagining religion, and I've been researching Christian mystics and Jewish mystics and Muslim mystics and Oregon. So Oregon believed in pre-birth, right? Something like to make sense of the fall.
I think it's pronounced origin.
Is it origin?
You know, David Bentley Hart believes in pre-existence. You know, lots
I
of
thought
people
you
in the
say he
Orthodox
believes
Church.
it's pronounced origin.
You know, there are like lots of Christians who have believed in pre-existence. There's a book by a Latter-day Saint scholar called Terrell Gibbons where he talks about the history of pre-mortal existence in Western thought, and there's lots of there's lots of undercurrents
Josh
in Christianity.
Rasmussen seemed to express.
Yeah, Robin
yeah.
Collins is sympathetic, and obviously the
Oh,
Church,
really?
the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, a whole Christian denomination, it just like accepts this as fundamental teaching.
I can't accuse people of not being Christian, but
even non-Christians.
Yeah, I mean, it's a
Yeah.
more promising theodicy, because it does seem to me that God infringes our rights by the allowing the suffering and our right to life and security and health. So if we've agreed to that, but so how does it work out then that like some people get in very nice cushy lives and some people have crap lives and die very young after horrific abuse or something? So is that just random?
Well, so I mean, I think
we-
that will be the thing that needs to be solved by the axiological problem of evil, right? So like the axiological problem of evil, there's going to have to be like some great good, either with the permission of those particular evils or with the system.
Do I consent to it being randomly decided?
Yeah, so I think that you could consent to that, or you could consent to a specific set of events, right? So you could consent to a set of options where God doesn't tell you which option you're getting, or you could consent to just like a very specific life where He tells you what it is in advance.
Well, no one's going to consent to like horrific abuse for 2 years and then you die.
Well, I mean, so like, what if He told you about the greater goods and your intellect is sort of on point?
Yeah, I should think about this more and think about it does sound to me a more promising theodicy than the others. Obviously, it's departing from what we think of as Orthodox Christianity.
I have an argument for why it's just it's not a problem that it's not a mainstream Christian teaching. So you usually if something isn't explicitly taught by Christianity and you sort of tack it on, that's going to be at cost, right? That's going to be an issue if you sort of add some theological doctrine that isn't in the tradition. But I think in this case, if it's true, we'd have like a special reason not to think that it would be taught by Christianity. Namely, God must have had some reason for wiping our memories if this is what happened, right? So we don't remember the pre-existent state. And so I think that nullifies the prediction that God would then tell us that we pre-existed through the Christian tradition.
I mean, I wonder whether another thing is just that which view is more complex, right? You're adding stuff, I'm adding. I don't think my limitation of God's powers is that complicated.
Well, I mean, so like,
whereas you're, adding this extra.
I think I get it for free if we've got the axiological problem of evil in the bag, which is why I think this is the problem that needs to be solved.
We get it for free.
Yeah.
Why do we get it for free?
Well,
we're still adding some.
So
you mean because it's what God would have done?
Yeah, we'd predict God to do it because it's the permissible way to do it. And even if you think that there are multiple permissible ways for God to allow evil, this would be the best one, right? So like God could rely on a hypothetical consent, right? Maybe, right? But you might think that if He has the option of getting our actual consent, that would be better. That seems intuitively plausible.
Going back to Origin. I mean, it does seem like the only plausible way of making sense of the fall in some kind of literal way, that there's because it was like what some man and woman they're to blame for my suffering doesn't make any sense at all. But if I was sort of if each of us consented that does and fell, but there's not necessarily falling, is it? If we just choose you're not bringing in the fall, are you?
Yeah.
There could be a fall.
You could have something
Yeah.
like that, couldn't
And
you?
this doesn't even need to make you more heretical. So the Catholic Church condemned Origenism, right? But Origen's view was that we were kind of sent to Earth as a punishment, and we pre-existed. So it's
I
a
see.
conjunctive claim, and the Church condemned that conjunctive claim. But
Okay.
it isn't it's never condemned like the singular claim that we pre-existed. So Jimmy Akin has a good podcast. He's a good Catholic where he says this is something that a Catholic can permissibly believe
Oh, I'd like
if
to
you
listen
don't
to that.
just
I want to get
don't believe
clear
in
on all
origin.
the heresy for this new book as well. What is? I don't really know what is heretical, what isn't heretical. Anyway,
Just what a
Yeah.
heretic would
Wait,
say.
sorry, Phil. What time do you want to head out?
oh, I'm probably gonna have to go in a few minutes. I know.
Okay.
It's a shame
Okay,
we don't
I
have
guess-
more time.
In the last few minutes, I can
Yeah.
describe the theodicy that I like most
Go on.
for
and then we'll-
solving the
we'll finish on
consequentialist
that.
problem of evil. So the idea is that so there are archons, these sort of angel or demon-like characters, and basically they were tasked with making the world really good, and they failed, which is why the world is defective in all sorts of ways.
Okay.
And so then you might ask, okay, well, why would God, have these archons who are tasked with making the world good and have some chance of failing? Well, the reason is that if in the worlds where the archons succeed, that brings about a really valuable good, namely this really important kind of connection between us and the archons. Just like if you pull someone out of a burning building, then it forges a connection between you and them, and the connection would last forever in the worlds where they save us. So God has to make it difficult for the archons to save us from this cruel fate. And then if God makes it difficult for the archons to save us from this cruel fate, then there's some chance of the archons failing. And then if the archons fail, that explains why the world looks so indifferent, because
So
basically the people tasked with making the world not indifferent failed.
So there's a good we're missing out on that people in other worlds get.
Right.
Right. That's sad.
Yeah. Well, maybe, if you think we pre-exist, maybe in other worlds, maybe we'll sort of repeat this, and then some of them will spend time.
I think solve the problem of evil. It also helps to believe in reincarnation, because there's a problem of why people live such short lives, why insects live such short lives. It's really puzzling.
John Hick believed in reincarnation.
Very based.
I mean, we are adding more complexity, aren't we? If we're bringing in other worlds and
well, I mean, Matthew, if the anthropic argument works, we get the multiverse. We get the multiverse at least free, right? Because
yeah, but that doesn't work, unfortunately. So
yeah, well, that is one of the most false things you've said so far.
I just think it does still seem to be sort of like tying ourselves in knots, trying to avoid what the data seems most straightforwardly to be suggesting. If physics, you just try and get the simplest theory that accounts for the data. You don't sort of, I don't know.
So physics describes everything in terms of highly precise, mathematical descriptions. Yeah. And so in physics, generally, adding epicycles is much worse. Well, with if we're looking for agents explaining things, then adding extra complexity makes more sense, right? Okay, so
yeah,
there was some historical person who was very near Pompeii and wrote about I think they wrote about Pompeii, but they just didn't describe the Mount Vesuvius eruption. And so you can say, well, maybe it didn't happen or something, but in the case of an agent, sometimes you just think, well, maybe the agent had some reason or just had some desire that we didn't know about. So in the case of an agent, it seems less like adding complexity.
Yeah, that's a good point. Yeah, well, I guess I'll just have to think more about these theodicies. They do sound more promising than, I guess, with the more what we think of as more orthodox ones in the present moment. They don't want to add stuff outside pre-existence or other. Yeah. So you're more limited, and it doesn't seem very plausible. But yeah, I'm probably gonna have to go. I'll think about it. You guys can have the last word. But
yeah, I'm out of words. So yeah, thanks so much for coming on, Phil.
Thanks a lot, guys.
All right, I guess
we could chat longer, but it's been nice.